lovelies. My name is Editor Lauren, and I am an author's best friend. And I'm here today with my bestie, Mina Myles.
Hello.
Mina, why don't you tell us what you're drinking?
Yeah, so I went very festive with my drink. So it's a peppermint tea, kind of getting into the winter vibes. It's also in this like fun little like Christmas tree themed mug. So that's what I'm drinking. What about you?
Cute. I, in classic Lauren fashion, have a red blend. So cheers. Cheers to getting to hear a little bit more about you and Troped. So as a little bit of an introduction, Mina is a full-time graduate student studying psychology, very broadly. And she's also the co-author of your favorite hockey romance, Troped. And Troped tells the story of Rose Thorne and Chase Matthews, two people that are sort of terrified of relationships, hoping to be troped into a loving connection. And so I was hoping that you could start by maybe elaborating on a little bit of what I just said. I gave you a very condensed intro, but then also talking a little bit about your journey to even putting, pen to paper, so to speak, and creating characters out of nothing.
Yeah, definitely. I find it really fun that you kind of describe Rose and Chase that way, because I definitely agree. I feel like with Rose, she kind of buries the lead a little bit because, when you're introduced to her, like she's this huge, like bookish, like romance lover, like reading all of like kind of the romances and love and like see all over Book Talk, Instagram. And so like on the surface, like you'd think that she'd like be super like pro relationship. It's not that she's not anti-relationship either, but like you think she'd be a little bit more confident, like would have like been in a long-term relationship. Like she even sets up maybe a little bit of a spoiler, but maybe not, it's in the blurb, I guess. Sets up like a little meet cute between her best friend and also like Chase's best friend. And so like you would think on the surface that she'd kind of like be a big go-getter, but because of like some things that have happened in her past, like she is like kind of like nervous about like being in a relationship. And then, we have Chase, who's like your kind of classic like hockey captain, who's like, I'm just way too busy to even entertain like a relationship. But, as you get to learn more about Rose and more about Chase, you find out that with him, it's also a little bit deeper than what's on the surface. The trope kind of follows like their friendship coming together, again, all because of this like little meet cute that Rose put together, a fun little spicy bet that they have with each other, where Rose is like, I can probably convince you that relationships are actually kind of fun and the thing that you should want. And then eventually, like them kind of falling for each other and ups and downs and journeys in between. Guaranteed happy ending in the end, with me always, but it is a bit of a journey. So that's, I guess, more of like my kind of broad overview. Also happy to talk more about that. But in terms of like putting pen to paper, I think for me personally, it was the summer after I had graduated and I'd started this like kind of job in between like undergrad and like applying to grad school. Like I always loved reading, grew up, loved reading. I think in undergrad, I just like didn't have as much time for it as like what I wanted. And then like the summer I graduated, I was texting like Sierra, and she just was like sending me book recs, and through that was like the first hockey romance I ever read. And I guess like I read one hockey romance like over 2 years ago at this point, and then now I decided to make it my whole personality, which is fine. And so we were kind of like sending like different like books back and forth. Or at least she was sending me books and I was sending her like, oh my gosh, what's happening and all these things. And then the more that we were kind of like doing this like little like text exchange book club, the more it was like, I wonder, like, is there a book out there that has like this? Like, we would find books about like female main characters who like loved reading, but maybe not necessarily like we're reading the exact books we were. And then again, like I was kind of falling in love with the like kind of off campus, like Briar U, like hockey boys. And so I think through just these conversations back and forth, like we were just like, what if we just, write a little like female main character who like is obsessed with like the books that we're reading currently, and then why not just make it a hockey romance, because that sounds like fun. And so I think initially we had like kind of sent to like just like text messages of like what the characters would be like and what they would say to each other, naturally like big dramatic like kind of things, and like breakup scenes and things like that. I think both of us maybe just have a tendency for like wanting to cause pain in like it gets resolved like, in a very fun way. So we have like bits and quotes of that, and then also just kind of compiling a list of like tropes that we like, tropes that we don't like, tropes that we think are like mid-tier where it's like we can throw in, but like, and so like it's kind of funny because looking back at it, maybe like the way that we approached as co-authors isn't typical. I don't necessarily know what a typical co-author relationship was like, but it was this kind of fun phase where it was like she would write like a chapter or two and then I would write like a chapter or two. And so it was like at the same time that we were writing this book, we also kind of got to like read the book, which is kind of funny. And so yeah, that was a very long-winded answer, but
yeah, you touched on so many things that I want to really dig into. Specifically about how the book idea came to be, because so you and I met at Mr. and Mrs. Spencer's wedding, and I knew that you were into romance, and that you worked in research, and so naturally, I knew that we would have lots of things in common and things to talk about. But I just really didn't see it coming when one day Sarah's like, here's a book cover. Yeah. There's a book that goes along with it, and it's co-authored, and I'm like, okay, sorry, does that say who's Mina Myles? And and then, she gives me the quick and dirty version of how this book came to be. But I'm just so curious to hear a little bit more from your perspective. More so about so at this stage, Developing Feelings had already come out, right? Mm-hmm. And so you knew that it was possible for at least someone that you knew to put a book together and get it out and get people reading it. And so had you even entertained ever writing something on your own, and you felt like maybe this, with Sierra together, we can do this and that will help me dip my toe into it? Did she kind of say, no, you should do this, I'll support you, and then it became one book? What did that conversation look like when it became okay, no, so we're actually doing this thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I feel like I don't know the exact timeline of when Troped and Developing Feelings was lining up. In terms of when both were being written. I think there was some overlap, but I remember her just texting me off the cuff being like, hey, what if there's this new workplace romance that's out, and what if it's written by me? And she just sends me a whole book, kind of similar to how she sent it to you. I guess with you probably were a little bit, hopefully you weren't offended when you were like, what is this new book that I now have to edit? But I know you're a bit more involved in her process. So with me, I was like, I'm just a reader. This is great. I just had to read it, which was a great experience. And so I just I remember being freaking out and being like, this is just so exciting. I had no idea that this was even an option, that self-publishing was even a thing that people could do. I had grown up obviously loving reading, and also I guess tied to that writing fan fiction, and I'd always kind of written stories, but I think that I for better or worse also have always been kind of practical in my brain, such that I was I want to be an author. I love writing, but I don't know if this can really pay the bills for me. And the stressors, talking to my mom too, and her being I don't know, you might want to just think about that. And so I think because of that, I veered away from writing, not writing, but I just kind of shifted more into psychology. I was okay, this is more a concrete thing, a more straightforward career path. I can do that. Mm-hmm. But I never lost the love of writing. And in the back of my head, I always was I'm going to publish a book one day. I don't know when, I don't know how, I don't know when it's going to happen. Maybe I'll just be in my 40s one day, on a vacation, writing away. And then naturally, we just started kind of writing this thing together. And I don't think I fully realized that oh, this could be a book until I want to say maybe it was halfway-ish written. And that was around the time in which Sierra was here's Developing Feelings. And I was wait, does that mean that Troped could be a thing? And then so that was kind of a really exciting, I think, moment for both of us.
Yeah, I feel it's at least from witnessing Sierra's how do I go from being a consumer of this, something that I really enjoy, and having ideas of my own, and turning this hobby into something that might be, something bigger than that. Not only just being profitable, but it's one thing to write, oh, I wish there was a book about this. I'm going to write this thing. I really like this trope, and then write it. And you just kind of giggle and read it in your room, and maybe you and your friends talk about it, versus putting it out into the community and having other people read it and critique it and have feelings about these characters you've written. It's a vulnerable but empowering place to be in, to be I'm actually going to do this thing, and I'm going to put it out there for other people to see.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the vulnerable piece, especially the putting it out there and realizing that oh yeah, this is some people could really like it, and some people could actually really not like it. And I feel like that piece is also like, not to like preemptively tease stuff, but like as I'm kind of working on like other things, like sometimes like when I have moments of insecurity, that kind of pops in my head. I'm like, ugh, is like someone not gonna like this? Or like I want them to do this, but like maybe that's not gonna be received well. And I think like it's a really tricky balance, like making sure you still have like your voice in your writing and that you're trying to get like out of the story what you want and what you feel like is right with your characters, while now also kind of thinking about like, okay, but like what does the audience like want, or like what are other people into? And I think when I was first like when we were first writing Troped, maybe I just didn't think about that too much, because in my head I was like, it could just, like, I think to your point, could just stay in the Word document, like it doesn't have to fully get out there. And so I feel like I didn't feel as much pressure, because I was just like, this is so great and I think it's a really great book, but if it stays in the Word document, like, I mean, kind of a bummer, but you know, also like I hadn't put myself out there at that point. So it was like there's like no expectations. So yeah, it's like it's a really interesting kind of space to be in.
Yeah. So admittedly, I'm I guess I say new, but I don't really feel new. I read like all of Elle Kennedy's Prior You series, so it feels like I'm pretty like indoctrinated into the hockey romance area. But and I just finished Icebreaker like this morning.
Nice.
But I'm curious. So for you, okay, so maybe my first question is like, A, how did you feel comfortable enough writing a hockey romance? Like you do have to have a little bit of knowledge, right, about like how the sport works.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think hockey games are like a really fun thing for people to go to, but I never really hear people saying like, oh, I'm a hockey fan. And so first question is like how your decision to write a hockey romance happened. And then the second follow-up thing I wanted to know is like hockey romance are, I feel like, really defined by certain qualities. Like you have to have this aspect in here. Like you have an alpha male. That's just like what makes it sort of hockey. Or that's a personality that comes with a hockey player. Yep. Oftentimes I feel like the male also has got some family stuff in the background, right? Like he's got, a dad that drinks or that gambles or is really rich and doesn't really care about him. Or there's something that like the female lead can fill some sort of space for him or be supportive for him in that way. Whereas he's like very protective and, will protect her in those sorts of ways where she's more of like, let me protect you emotionally.
I like that.
And a million other things. And so first question is like, what's your familiarity with hockey? And then following up is like, what absolute tropes or like pieces of hockey did you have to make sure were in Trope to make it like, true to the genre?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay. So how I got into hockey, honestly, I feel like a massive reason is just like I went to undergrad in Boston, and I also like stayed in Boston a couple years after that when I was working. And so like it's a really big hockey culture, and my undergrad actually didn't have a football team. The only like our big sports team was the hockey team. And so Saturday nights and like Friday nights were spent like going to hockey games, and like that was kind of what we did. And so yeah, it was very fun. I think also too, just so basically like I think that I like slowly like became a hockey fan. I can't say that I was one like before I like moved to Boston, but definitely like I feel like it's just kind of like a really fun like atmosphere, like when you're surrounded by like a bunch of people who are kind of like into this thing. And it's also just like very fast paced. Like I find myself with certain sports, like the reason why I don't enjoy them is because I just like lose my attention. And then once I'm like on my phone and scrolling, like we're kind of just done. And so, but like hockey is like super fast paced. So like the games are super fun. And so, yeah, I think just like over the years, I actually like became a pretty big hockey fan, and definitely went to a bunch of undergrad games, went to like a ton of Bruins games and playoff games. And I think, the Boston element is very like prevalent in Troped. And I think a big reason for that was, I don't know if I fully realized it at the time, but I had spent so long in Boston and I really like loved it there. And I knew that like I was applying to grad school soon in a couple of years, and so probably wouldn't be there anymore. And I think when I finished the book, I remember thinking that this kind of just feels like one really big love letter to like my time there. And so that was like I think really kind of like special to me. And so there's like bits and moments of like hockey games, like research, like all these things that kind of meant a lot to me in my time there. So that's how like that's my I guess like knowledge of hockey, like my like fandom of hockey, how I got into it. And then in terms of like tropes that like must be, I think, in a hockey romance, I don't know if this, I mean, we kind of made it a trope in Troped, and I view it as a trope, but I love a good, like, he's like the captain, like he's like the alpha male, like super, but like also like responsible and like all his like teammates like count on him. I feel like hockey romances tend to have a lot of like found family themes in them. And I really, really love that. I think that's like one of my kind of favorite tropes. So I love to have like a like found family type of element in it. Love to make him a captain if I can, make him like kind of in charge. And yeah, I think those are kind of my two big things. I think also maybe going back to like your first question of how I became a fan from like a more writer's perspective, like some things that I like, I don't say struggle with, but sometimes kind of like toggle back and forth is like I do have like I'd like to think like a decent knowledge of like the game and like how like it's played and stuff. And sometimes I'm like I will put in a bunch of detail about like the game and what's happening, but then I also think back to when I'm reading other sports romances where I'm like, I don't know if I really care about football and like what's happening on the field. And so I like will cut back, but then I'm like, as a hockey fan, I kind of want this info. But yeah, so that's kind of a fun space to be into sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's a sign of really good writing when you can convey the intensity of the moment as if you're that person's like partner sitting and watching. Like I can think of majority of hockey romance where they're describing like, so and so like stealing the puck from somebody and lining up to take a shot and then getting like totally like shoulder checked and as you're sitting pretending you're Rose or whatever, you're like I'm worried for Chase, like I can feel it and I can see the scene playing out, and if you can really rope a reader in that way such that they envision themselves as that character, then all of the little details are actually necessary for your imagination to kind of run wild and feel it. Whereas other times you're just kind of like, this is too much technical detail. Can we get to the romance, please?
Right, definitely.
So were there any scenes that you were like dying to write, or like any tropes that you were like, this is what I wanted in a book and I'm going to write it and I'm going to do it well?
I think it's a bit more of like a micro trope, but I love a little jealousy moment. Like I love a like he
you
sees
can't
her
have pain if you don't have jealousy.
Very true. But I love a little like he sees her with someone else. And so in Troped, basically part of it is like Rose is trying to get Chase to like kind of believe in relationships, and then as she's slowly starting to feel like or fall for him, and she's like, like let's cut the brakes here, like I wasn't really supposed to be falling for him, she just comes up with this like genius plan of like, the way to get him into like liking relationships is just like set him up with someone else, and then we'll just go and I'll just like find this guy that like Chase is already jealous of, and already is kind of like doesn't really like. It's funny because when Sierra and I were writing, in the notes we had like character profiles, and next to this like kind of for the plot like secondary male we put like has a death wish just because he keeps like flirting with like Rose in front of Chase and like actively kind of like irritating him.
Okay, but Sam is the best. I love Sam so much.
Sam really, the poor thing, like he was just like he was not coming from a malicious place. Like he really was just trying to like get to know Rose more, and she's so great, like obviously. But Sam had a death wish, and so we had this really fun scene again in Rose's genius, and when she's like, it's going to be me and Sam and Chase and this other girl where we're going to go on a double date with each other, and this whole time Sam's like flirting with her, like being really touchy. And then Chase just kind of like loses it and storms out. And that's like a really fun scene.
I love that scene so much.
It's really good.
And I feel like even just the way you've constructed their like in hockey romance, you might have like the fake dating, or, I'm going to help you get this other person just by being your friend. This whole book club idea is so genius, and it's such like a nod to all of the very classic romance books, and also really helps like something that a lot of, I think, romance consumers like ourselves have to deal with is the constant teasing about, the smut that we're reading, right? Which is like, no, I read like 300 pages of plot with like 50 pages of really genuine connection.
Yeah.
Please don't call it that. But I love Rose's tenacity of like defending this and such that she's like, no, you're actually going to learn something really useful from these books. We're going to have this book club and you're going to be able to fall in love with someone. And I think it's so genius. And it also really sets up this nice like stretch of jealousy that can come from it, because it's like, I'm just prepping to put you out in the world to somebody else. Right. You're not mine.
Yes.
Which sets up for pain perfectly. I love it so much.
Yeah, it was really fun kind of pulling at the time like what we had, like Sierra and I had, as like our favorite books, and like actively having like Rose kind of bring them up. And yeah, to your point, like kind of calling out that like don't know if like double standards the right word, but like sometimes romance gets like a lot of like just like shit for it. I don't know if I can curse on this podcast. We can edit it out.
Yeah, go for it.
We can bleep it out. Yeah, it just gets like a lot of shit for like the fact that there was like smut scenes in it. And it's like, to your point, yeah, like we've read like so many pages and there's so many like lessons you can learn and things like that. And I think Chase slowly like very much comes to realize that, and also comes to realize like one, like how important they are to Rose and why, and also that like he starts to like them a lot too, which is like it's what happens when you like go in open-minded. I think like romance novels can really be a really fun thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, I totally agree. So, and then another thing I was wondering about is like, okay, so maybe one of the best parts about co-authoring a book, I can imagine, is that you write something and then you've got some writer's block and you're like, I'm going to leave. And then you come back and actually there's some new plot in there that you can build off of. And so what was that experience like? Like you would write something down. Had you and Sierra already talked about like the direction you were going to go in? Or was it just like whenever you open the document, just put stuff in there and then I'll come in at some point and put stuff in there. And then, you know, some sucker down the line will have to make these things cohesive. Insert sucker.
I was going to say insert editor Lauren.
No, it was such a great joy to read your two characters and like, you know, figure out. There were some chapters I'd read just because I'm familiar with Sierra's writing and I was like, this is her. And then to read stuff, I'm like, oh, this is cute. I feel like that Sierra didn't write this. I feel like this is Mina. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a lot of fun. I wish I could like be in your brain as you were trying to figure out who was writing what. That sounds like fun. Yeah, I think like by and large, like it was, and this is why I think in the beginning I said like maybe this is more atypical. Like by and large, it was kind of like I'm gonna write a little bit, and then like Sarah would come in and write, and then we would just kind of like continue each other's like work. And then, but there were moments too where like I would maybe veer like left. Like I think that for me, and I've maybe hinted at this, sometimes the easiest thing for me to write is those like pain points. So like one of the first things I remember early on, and I think it was like chapter 6, I had already caused this big like pain point in tension. And she was like, maybe we should save this until like a little bit further along once we like know these characters had like built their background. And I'm like, no, you're totally right. I was like, yeah. I was like, yep, this is just me being dramatic. And naturally I'm like putting that in my writing. And so like, and we would have moments like that where like maybe sometimes we were like, okay, like I'm not sure if I fully saw it going this way. Like, what about this? Or like, what about that? But by and large, it was really just like she would write a little bit, I would write a little bit. And then yeah, to your point, like if one of us got stuck, like I would definitely like text her and be like, I did this, like I don't exactly know where to go next. So I'm tagging you in. And she would kind of do the same. And so that was really fun.
Was there any drafting beforehand? Like this is like the type of ending we're looking for, or like this is how we're gonna do, you know, a third act breakup or create tension, or like was any of that drafted out, or did it just kind of what I like to call the anthropomorphic hands, which is like it just kind of writes itself as the story unfolds?
Yeah, definitely the latter. It just kind of like wrote itself. I think what was tricky for both of us was once we had kind of caused like that third act breakup, or maybe not tricky, like so we caused a third act breakup, and then we kind of like talked with each other like how it would get resolved, and we knew like broadly like who had to be the one to like fix it, but we didn't know how we were going to get there. And I think like there was basically like a decent amount of time in which like maybe like 6-ish months, maybe even more, in which like it just kind of stood there, like it just kind of like sat, because I think neither of us really knew like how we would actually get to kind of like fixing this. And I will say like historically, again, maybe tied to like I guess just like causing pain, I promise I like happy endings as well. I love them, actually. That's why all I read is romance. But in like all the previous stories I had written, like getting to that point was like easy. And in my head, like I was like, oh yeah, the characters forgive themselves and they move on. But I never actually wrote that kind of part. And so that was like, I think really like challenging and difficult. And I think, yeah, I just maybe needed to like take a step back, and then like we would text now to be like, hey, it's still unfixed, like should I fix it, should you fix it? And she was like, one of us has to fix it. And then one day I think I was literally just like on a plane, and I was like going to be on that plane for like hours, and I was like, we're fixing it today. And we just like kind of went for it. And then I texted her, and then she was like, can't wait to read it.
I feel like to me, maybe the co-authoring experience isn't that different from single authoring, and that I imagine a lot of authors are kind of like, this is a problem for another me in the future. I'm just going to leave it. And then you go back and you're like, is today the day that I fix it? Am I in the mood for this? No, I'm not doing this today. Maybe one day I'll come back and finish it. And then, you know, when you're in the right mood, today's the day. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write this ending.
Yep, exactly. It's like kind of diffusion of responsibility. Just, I guess, when you have a co-author, you can like throw it onto someone else. But still in the end, I think you still kind of have to face like the consequences of your actions.
Yes. And sometimes maybe you're facing the consequences of someone else's actions. I didn't want to write that scene and you wrote it, and you know, I don't know how to build off of that, but I guess I have to. Yep. So one thing I like to do is I like to go through a couple of reviews, whether that be from social media or Goodreads, to kind of not only just share with everybody the hype that people feel over your characters, but also just to kind of gauge what that's like for you, because it's got to be so surreal, right? That you put words on a page and you made people that, you know, come from maybe a little bit of you, a little bit of Sierra, a little bit of somebody else you knew, and they just, you know, were born out of the pages and people fall in love with them, and what that's been like for you, like seeing people's thoughts. So, couple of them from Goodreads. Somebody said, this was so cute. Chase was the sweetest and such a book boyfriend. His love for Rose and how he kept showing up for her. I love it. I honestly hate the nickname baby girl because of an ex, but Chase single-handedly redeemed this word for me. Definitely swooned a lot over Chase. Such high praise.
Oh, Chase Matthews, get you a hockey captain. I
mean, it's, I can't even imagine, like, to have a nickname ruined because of an ex, and then the guy, Chase Matthews, the man you made, redeemed it. It's true. He pulls it off so well. Like, it sounds very sincere and it's very cute. I even, you know, raised a little eyebrow. I was like, oh, baby girl. All right. Like, it's cute as a joke. And then now we're saying it sincerely, and he pulls it off so well.
I think that's like it's a really fun moment, because it's one of those moments, I think, where like even in real life where you like initially are saying things ironically and then somehow it like incorporates into your like everyday vocab. And in his instance, it's like, I think he like makes a nod to it at one point, that it's kind of like the equivalent of his like hands off rule that like Garrett Graham has in The Deal. And so I can't remember if it was either Nate or Shep who like teased him about it, but they're like, well, yeah, like no one's gonna go near her because you keep claiming her like that. Kind of
Yes, I love that. Somebody else said, so cute and perfectly reflects how we all feel when we read our romance books, which we already kind of talked about. Totally true. And then some of my favorites, starting being the last line of the book, which I had to bring out my actual physical copy to read this to you.
We love all the tabs too.
Oh, yeah. Which is a Chase chapter. And he says, I wondered if this is how Rose's characters feel at the end of her books, filled with love and contentment, knowing all they'll ever need is the person standing in front of them. I mean, just got me. Like, it's good pain, but like, this line does such a good job of just like summarizing the journey they took on this book, and also just like the vibe that you were trying to set with book name being Troped.
Yeah.
And it ties it all together so well. And then the other thing I really love is I adore Rose. I think I should make that clear. But I just, for some reason, have been hyper-focusing on Chase, which, you know, he's a great boyfriend. So. Yes. But his little love you bye when he's half asleep, it's like the little things that he does like that totally humanize him. Like, it was making me, like, my fiance calls his mom babe sometimes on the phone, and it makes me like pee my pants laughing. I think it's so funny. It's just like, just their dynamic. That's just like awkward thing for him to do, and I know it kills him. And so I was like in that moment when he's like, okay, love you, bye, and he's half asleep, and I was like, oh my God, he's such a real person in this moment. The little quirks that were placed in there just really help make these characters feel like somebody that you know.
Yeah, I think for me, like one of like my favorite parts of a book when I'm reading it are those like little quirks when you're like, oh, that was actually like really human of you. Like sometimes like and there's nothing wrong with like book boyfriends being like super perfect. Like obviously that's why we're reading them. That's why we're into them. That's why we make merch for them. Like we want them to be this like really idealistic kind of thing. But I always loved when like the characters would have just those little moments of like humanity where you're like, oh yeah, like you are kind of just like this like college guy who's like never been in a relationship and is figuring it out, and naturally that's going to lead to like you awkwardly being like love you to like this girl that you're crushing on, but you don't want her to know that yet, and then like freaking out over it, and her teasing you about it. So yeah, that was really cute.
Yeah, so sweet. Oh, I love Chase. And then, okay, so after, all the fun stuff about writing, it's also, I think, important to kind of talk about maybe the things that are a little bit harder. And maybe this is the time where you can talk about maybe some of the things that you want to do moving forward. Like, in what ways do you think that it was nice having a co-author? In what ways do you think it would make things difficult, if you were writing books by yourself? Or what sorts of things during that process felt like, like you were saying, this is my hobby and I want to write, these books that maybe that I would have liked to have seen that I don't have. But now I also kind of have to think about the reader, and that changes maybe the way that I would do some things. Like, what are parts of that process that maybe you found hard?
Yeah, I think for me, the part that is always a little bit challenging is in my head, I make up these characters. Like, I personally know like what they're going through, what their background kind of story is, like where I want them to go. And sometimes because I know them so well in my head, I actually like forget to put that on paper. And so I think that's something that like Sierra like helped out a lot with, was like when I would have like those moments, and she was like, okay, I get why Rose is doing this, or I get why Chase is doing this. We just haven't really explained that yet. Like, we haven't like fully given like the reader a reason as to why, as opposed like, whereas like if the reader just read it as is, they might be like, this is kind of out of character, like where is this coming from? Like, we know where it's coming from, but they might not. And so I think for me, yeah, it's always been a bit challenging to just make sure that like the thoughts that I have in my head are like actually like getting portrayed. I think sometimes too, because it's like, I think because that is a sticking point for me, it is easier for me to write scenes where it's like the plot is just moving, and then like going back and sitting down and like adding in more detail about character background. And I think also too, like I kind of struggle sometimes with like, is this too much detail? Is this not enough? Like, I know like when I'm reading books, like sometimes I'm like, and I think this mainly falls into like the romantasy genre. So maybe this just says like a little bit about me, but sometimes when there's like a little too much world building or just a little bit too much, like I just end up skimming it. Either skimming it or I just get overwhelmed and I'm like, oh, okay, maybe we won't read this now. We'll come back to it. And so I think that like I struggle like overall sometimes with like incorporating that like more background into my books. And part of it might just be that like I'm overthinking the process. I'm like, I don't want to do too much. Like, I don't know if this is enough. So yeah, that's definitely like a tricky element. And having a co-author was nice to kind of like just one, bounce ideas off, but two, also just like utilize like their skill set. Like, you are working with like another writer, and so it's like nice to kind of like tag them in when you're feeling stuck. And I guess yeah, to your like kind of second question about like, looking forward, I don't know, this might be like a little podcast exclusive. I am currently working on my second book, that is I want it to be, and I think it will be like the first in kind of like a series of like individual standalones. Again, hockey romance, because I guess that's my whole personality now. A second chance hockey romance. But yeah, as I'm kind of creating this new story and these new set of characters, I feel like I like, again, in my head, like know what their background is, and I'm just trying to like make sure I'm captivating that on paper. I think part of it too is, since I'm writing a second chance romance, which I've never done before, I'm like, I need to give them sufficient enough background, because if not, like the pain's not going to feel like what it feels like. And so like figuring that out has been like a really interesting journey. And I also think now too that it's like, oh, this is like my second book. Like, I am like officially like an author now. Not that I wasn't when I put my first book out, but I feel like there's something about writing the next one that really, at least for me, makes it feel like, oh, this is like a thing that I'm doing now. Like, this is something that like I'm, putting myself out there now, and like as like an author. And so with the first book, I think I was just like writing what I wanted to write. And like, I think I was in my head, like just more of a reader. Like, I think it just felt more like, I guess, akin to like my fan fiction writing days. I was like, I've entered this like community that I love, and I'm just going to write these like fun little stories. Whereas with this second book, I'm now like, oh no, I'm like an author. And so I need to be thinking, and not only like, what do I want, but like, what would readers want? And while still making sure that my voice is conveyed. And I think that's like been a really interesting headspace to be in.
Yeah. And so you feel like this experienced co-authoring has kind of helped prepare you to take on this journey. I'm guessing that these are not all co-authored series, so you'll be taking charge of all of your characters moving forward. So you feel like that learning experience of co-authoring is kind of going to help propel you forward into this new chapter of solo writing?
Yeah, I definitely think so, because I still kind of was able to, like, even though we co-authored it, like there were definitely, I think what you like hinted at earlier, like chapters where you're like, oh, I can tell this is Sierra, and like chapters where you're like, oh, I can tell that this is like Mina. And so I think that like it allowed me to like build my confidence like as a writer, like having a co-author, like maybe like for the first book for me, like taking the pressure off a little bit of like I can kind of like write in my own style, and also like she's put stuff out too, so like, you know, the feedback that she gave me or that you gave me, you know, like that also like helped build my confidence of like, no, this is like a book that people like enjoy and like I can do this like writing thing. So I think now it's really honestly just like trusting myself and like reminding myself, like moments where I'm like writing solo now, where I get insecure, I'm like, no, but like you put out a book and people liked it. And it's also fine if people didn't like it, but you know, like you put out a book and it made some people happy. And so like, you know what you're doing and just kind of trust your gut. So that's what I'm trying to kind of internalize when I have like moments where I'm like a little insecure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when people read a hockey romance that they enjoy, I think, at least in my experience, that author becomes an insta buy when I know that their book is coming out, because it's like, I think hockey romances in general, there's just sort of like you were saying, the vibe of like going to games and it's cold, so you're kind of bundled up. Doesn't really matter like what time of year it is, and it's like, you know, it's a really aggressive sport, and it makes the audience watching really want to be aggressive, and like hockey romances just kind of put you in that, and then it's your job to just kind of like craft a sweet romance that goes along with that. And so I think, I mean, you've definitely done that, and so I think everybody who at least who has read Troped is very excited to see where you take them. One person in particular had mentioned on Goodreads that side characters are just as good as the main characters, and I cannot wait to see if we get more from this friend group. And so I'm curious if I'm sure you've entertained the idea of giving some of these other characters their own book, and you say second chance, and a part of me wishes, I love Naomi. I love her. I love Shep. Yeah. And so is there any chance that they're your second chance romance? Like they break up and then you got to write a new book for them? Because I want a Shep book so bad.
Wait, I'm kind of upset I didn't think about that. Oh no. I mean, hey, just because they're not now doesn't mean that they like couldn't be. I think Shep and Naomi are just like so stable, and like they go through their own stuff in Troped as well, but like they like are kind of like, you know, pitched as like that kind of stable like couple, and so it's nice to have like them as like a comfort. But you're definitely not the first person to be like, oh, I just really wanted like Shep and Naomi's book. So I don't know, maybe we can go and do like a dual timeline situation where it's like their book through like around the time when like Rose and Chase are kind of figuring their stuff out. So the tea behind my current like work in progress is that it wasn't actually Shep's book that I sought out to write. It was Nate's. And so I initially started writing it with this like idea that it would be like Nate Cameron's book. You know, he was like a big playboy. We can like work with that. Like I loved a reformed playboy. But then the more I kept writing it, the more I was like, this isn't Nate's book. I don't know whose book this is. It's like a secret like third character that kind of sneaked up on me. But I'm definitely like, I'm not opposed at all to like one day going back, maybe like in between like Sierra and I working on our like other projects, we can like link up again and like do another like co-authored book. Another reason why I love like hockey books, not that this is just like with respect to hockey romances, but I feel like hockey romances also do like a really good job of like building like side characters and making you really interested in those like side characters and their teammates and their friends. And so it was like not fully intentional when we were writing like Nate and Shep that like, okay, each character would get a book, but I was like, I'm gonna build them enough that if one day we're like, whatever happened to Nate Cameron or whatever happened to Shep, like we can kind of go back. So yeah, unfortunately, my current work in progress is not a Shep and Naomi second chance romance, but
a girl can dream.
Yeah, one day, why not?
Yeah, in the coffee shop, as soon as Nate was like, well, my sister reads these books and she got me to read a Tessa Bailey. I was like, I want to know so much more about that.
Yes.
We'll have to unpack that at a later time.
Yes. We will one day. All we have is time.
We'll keep our eyes out. So why don't you tell us where we can get Troped and where we can see more of your content and maybe get some sneak peeks on your work in progress?
Yeah, so Troped is out on Kindle Unlimited. Also out in I think most retailers like Barnes and Nobles. I think it's on Apple Books. I think, pretty much everywhere you can probably get a book or EPUB, it's out. So yeah, definitely go check it out. In terms of social media, I'm on Instagram at Mina Myles Books, also on TikTok under the same kind of and also recently kind of dipped into Threads, which is Instagram's equivalent of Twitter, and that's actually been really fun. Yeah, that's been a fun space to connect with readers and writers, and I feel like I've initially been kind of getting my toes wet with putting myself out there more. It's I feel like that's another thing that I'm trying to not second guess as much. And I'm also realizing is really important with putting books out is marketing yourself as an author.
Absolutely.
I think that's a space where I never thought I would necessarily be in, and maybe the introvert of myself was dying a little bit, but it is really fun to connect with people. And so currently on Threads have very, very minimally teased my latest work in progress, but I think more teachers will definitely come in the new year.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit behind the scenes of Rose and Chase and being so vulnerable with your writing journey. We're also excited to see what you bring us next. Awesome. Well, it was so fun chatting with you, Mina.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren.
See you next time.